for me without actually running. I purely did breathwork training exercises to train for that marathon. Then I taped my mouth shut and I breathed entirely through my nose for the duration of that marathon. I did finish it. I also learned a lot. There's a little photo there, as you can see, of me running in that nasal marathon. I then took it to another level where I really wanted to test out the theory and science around high altitude breathwork training. And by the way, I kind of view myself a bit as that conduit between the theory and scientific worlds of breathwork training, especially a lot of the new research that's coming out around this stuff, and actually how to apply it in the real world. And so I did my next challenge, which was the sea level to 14er. I trained at sea level, and then without ever having been above actually 11 or 12,000 feet before, I then went directly to a 14er and climbed that again with my nose only. And I got to see the reaction of the body myself firsthand of what high altitude breathwork training can do. So I really was putting to the test a lot of that published scientific research that I mentioned. I did get, all right, it looks like we're going in and out on audio potentially.
No, we got it.
But I think
we got it.
We're all back. Yeah. Okay, cool. And thanks a lot for giving a heads up on that, everybody, and appreciate that. So some of the research, just to give you a high level idea of the research that's out there on high altitude breathwork training, something in particular called hypercapnic, which means high carbon dioxide, hypoxic, which you may know already from some altitude things that you've done in your life. That means low oxygen. This style of breathwork training and the impact that it can have on somebody's, for example, hemoglobin concentration, which is basically your red blood cell count, the oxygen carrying cells in your body, and then how it actually translates to a VO2 max. There's so much research that's been done around that style of breathwork training. And I, again, was challenging that by creating some of these, real world examples of how to train for and then put it to the test. Some other examples of some research that's out there is how to actually unlock the power of erythropoietin or EPO to actually then create new red blood cells in the body just using breathwork training. Effects of apnea training, which is simply just breath hold training, and then also the impact of slow, deep breathing while at altitude. That's more of a while you're in the altitude, how can you breathe more efficiently type of research. There's one study in particular that I want to bring to light here with this particular audience, and that is around respiratory muscle training, in particular the inspiratory muscle training. So your inhale, the muscles that are engaged in an inhale are your diaphragm and your intercostal muscles. We're going to talk a lot about those two muscle groups in this information session, but there was some really interesting research done on this particular style of breathwork training and what it showed that in a 4 to 6 week breathwork training program, you can increase the strength of these muscles by about 15%. They were using a metric called maximal inhalation pressure, or MIP, to actually track that strength. So the subjects saw in 4 to 6 weeks, using a training plan, 15% increase in strength. What that then translated in the quote unquote real world outside the lab on a mountain at high altitude was upwards of 10% increase in somebody's ability to maintain their oxygen saturation levels in the blood. That's your SpO2. Now, what they also saw from experiencing this respiratory muscle training was an increase of 12% in their VO2 max. Obviously, that's a metric I'm sure a lot of you out there are really familiar with. That is your total oxygen uptake capacity in your body. And just by doing this RMT for 4 to 6 weeks, the training subjects saw an improvement of 12% in their VO2 max. That's like extremely significant. So there's another reason why, again, I saw these numbers and I was like, okay, we got to test some of this stuff out. I need to feel it with my own body. I'm sure you might be thinking the same thing. Along the way of doing my own tests and working with some of the best breathwork coaches in the world, I ended up putting together through my company, Recal, a high altitude breathwork training program, which is basically a 5-week, what we call pre-acclimatization breathwork training program. This is a nice addition or complement to what you're already doing from a training standpoint. And you can fit it right into that last 5-week block or so worth of fitness training just before you actually go out on the course or race or whatever you're actually training for. We've had a lot of clients at this point come through this training program, and a lot of people reach new heights in their lives on mountains, in races and everything. I did just have some clients recently over this past weekend at a big race, go through the training program as well and saw great benefits. I won't mention that race by name, but but we've had a lot of really good results, as you can see from even some of these testimonials. Now, let's dive a bit more into the hard science around what happens to your body at altitude. I want to make a disclaimer before I jump in, and that is that I am not a medical doctor. Again, as I mentioned before, I see myself and my role in this whole big scheme of things as the conduit between the doctors and the researchers and the scientists, and then the real world people that are actually putting these things to the test out in their everyday lives and funneling up to a race or a peak that they're trying to accomplish, a high altitude trek of some sort. So that's really how I view myself. So take that, of course, disclaimer as we dive into this. Now, I'm going to focus again on what happens with your body at altitude in the respiratory system in particular. There's a lot of other things happening in your body. Again, I'm really honed in on the respiratory system. And there's really three key areas that I want to focus on here. Number one, you experience at altitude an increase in your respiratory rate. That's how many breaths you take per minute. Your body is trying to exchange gas more often to combat that thinner air that's at altitude. And so you're experiencing an increase in the respiratory rate. Subsequently to that, and not necessarily driven by the heart rate does your breath increase, it's actually a result of the breath increasing that then your heart rate increases. And in particular, your body is trying to move more oxygen-rich blood flow. And I'll get into how exactly your body gets more oxygen-rich blood going through the body. And then the last component of this is you pee more while at altitude. You will experience a higher rate of urination. That is a byproduct of your body trying to get rid of something called bicarbonate at altitude. And I'll explain what that is as well. Let's go into each of these three components in a bit more detail here. So on the increased respiratory rate side, let's talk about what's going on there. As you climb or as you show up on a race and you're racing up the side of a mountain, here in Colorado, for example, through HPRS, there is lower pressure in the air as you climb. For example, the partial pressure of oxygen at sea level is about 160 millimeters of mercury. That's a metric used to measure pressure, partial pressure. And at sea level, it's 160. On a 14er in Colorado, for example, it's around 95 millimeters of mercury, or 60% of that which you'd experience at sea level. Another example is Kilimanjaro. We're looking at 49% of what you'd experience at sea level at 78 millimeters of mercury. And then at the highest point of land, at least on Earth, that's Everest summit, you're looking at 53 millimeters of mercury, or 33% of the oxygen you experience at sea level. So air becomes lower pressure at altitude. That drops the partial pressure of oxygen that you're facing, which means for every inhaled breath that you're taking, you're bringing in less oxygen. What that's going to do in your body, it's going to start to stimulate or send signals to the chemoreceptors in your brainstem. What those are going to then send out a message for your body to do is that your ventilatory centers respond by attempting to breathe faster. Now, I'm here to tell you that ironically, potentially, based on what your prior beliefs are up to this point, ironically, breathing faster is not necessarily always better, especially if you have poor breathing mechanics already. That could be just from poor breathing habits that you've just developed over time, or, and this is a really key one, or your respiratory muscles, being your diaphragm and intercostal muscles in particular, aren't conditioned enough to handle that increased workload. So we're addressing here like the problem, framing the problem here of what happens at altitude as a result of that increase in respiratory rate. Now let's frame the problem around the second category of thing, which is the increased heart rate, in particular, again, that oxygen-rich blood flow. So what's happening here? Your kidneys start to receive less oxygen. As we talked about lower pressure in the air, they're receiving less oxygen per inhaled breath. They are then going to respond by increasing the synthesis of something called EPO, or erythropoietin. Maybe you've heard of this before. This has been kind of on center stage from doping scandals, especially in the cycling world. EPO leads to more red blood cells, right? Your body naturally creates more EPO when it's at altitude from the kidneys. However, this natural adaptation, known as acclimatization, takes time. And I'll get into how you can use breathwork to actually go up to the mountain already somewhat pre-acclimatized to help expedite that process. So this is kind of framing the problem set number 2 here on getting more oxygen-rich blood flowing through your body. Now, this third category of thing, which is increased urination, let's focus in on that. And in particular, your body here is trying to get rid of bicarb, or something called bicarbonate. Bicarbonate exists in your blood, in your body, due to overbreathing that's happening at altitude. See, it's a big chain reaction that kind of starts with that increased respiratory rate. The bicarbonate is a result of overbreathing, which ultimately causes respiratory alkalosis. If you breathe more than you normally would, the balance of the pH of your blood gets thrown off. You become more alkaline. If you're breathing more often, you're exhaling more carbon dioxide than you normally would. So what are some of the problems, so to speak, around respiratory alkalosis? This limits something called the Bohr effect. It's named Bohr because a guy named Christian Bohr, a chemist physicist in Denmark, discovered that the oxygen that the hemoglobin in your red blood cells, that it grabs from your lungs basically to distribute through your body, there's a certain affinity or connection between that hemoglobin and the oxygen molecule. What the Bohr effect states is that in a higher pH environment of your blood, that connection between the oxygen molecule and your hemoglobin, it increases. What that means is that the hemoglobin is not going to as easily deliver the oxygen to the muscles, tissues, organs, places in your body that actually needs this oxygen, if in fact your pH of your blood is higher. What happens when you exhale a lot of carbon dioxide is exactly that. pH goes up. You're experiencing respiratory alkalosis. So this is a sort of negative impact on your muscles and organs receiving oxygen if in fact the pH in your blood is higher. Now, I do want to note there is a place for some controlled heightened respiratory rate on the mountain to off balance the pH of your blood. This is going to promote acclimatization. However, I argue and contend, and the research backs this up as well, in the moments where you're experiencing high exertion, aka maybe you're racing at altitude, this is not necessarily a good thing. Again, your muscles really need that oxygen. So we want to actually not necessarily overbreathe at altitude. So this is kind of the overview of those 3 categories that are happening. Now we're going to dive back into it with the mindset of how does breathwork training actually address each of those 3 things here. And again, we're going to start with that increased respiratory rate. What you can do with breathwork training is improve the efficiency of your breathing. Again, if you're going to breathe more and your breathing is already inefficient, you're actually doing yourself a real disservice. So what we do through breathwork training, or can do, what you can do through breathwork training, is improve the efficiency of your breathing. Now, what that means is breathing with your nose, breathing slow, and breathing low, using your diaphragm, breathing low to get that air deep into your lungs. This is where the bulk of the gas exchange happens into your bloodstream. So we want you to effectively be slowing down your respiratory rate. This is a more efficient breath. Maybe ironic again, but it is a more efficient breath. One of the reasons why it's more efficient is if you breathe more slowly, you actually eliminate dead space, as it's called, which is the air that's basically stuck in either your nose or on the way to your lungs, but not actually being utilized and getting into your bloodstream. That is dead space. If you breathe more slowly, you're actually eliminating its impact on how much gas you can get into your lungs and then into your bloodstream. You'll then be able to, obviously, through breathwork training, not only use the full lung capacity that you have by breathing more efficiently, but through breathwork training, you can actually increase your total lung capacity and actually be able to put in more air into your lungs through that increased capacity. And then lastly, you'll be able to properly engage your diaphragm, again, through more efficient breathing. Now, due to the increased respiratory rate that you'll be facing at altitude already, your respiratory muscles, again, in particular, your diaphragm and your intercostal muscles, they have to work harder. And they have to work harder not only because you're breathing more, also because the thinner air at altitude requires then that you have to pull in the air into your lungs. I'm going to explain that a bit more later, but just put a little bookmark in your mind that we're going to revisit that thinner air and how much your diaphragm needs to work harder to pull in the air. So this is, again, in that category of increased respiratory rate. We're going to jump now into that middle category, the increased heart rate, in particular, that oxygen-rich blood flow. So how does breathwork training actually relate to this? It relates to it by your ability to make physiological adaptations in really two key areas. The first area is by using breathwork training, in particular of the high altitude simulation or intermittent hypercapnic hypoxic training, which is from that first study that I showed up there briefly in one of those slides earlier, you can actually increase your red blood cell count in your body using breathwork training. This is done through erythropoietin release, which is done through strong breath holds and various breath hold plus movement exercises. You can literally show up to the mountain more ready for acclimatization. This is why we call our breathwork training pre-acclimatization training. The second adaptation that you're able to make using breathwork training is improving your carbon dioxide tolerance. This is a very, very key element to breathing and breathing more efficiently. This may be one of the most important things that I'm going to touch upon in this information session. So if you are taking notes, jot this particular one down. Through breathwork training, you can improve your carbon dioxide tolerance. So what is carbon dioxide tolerance exactly? Carbon dioxide, as opposed to what most people think oxygen does, is it's the trigger for breathing. If you were to right now, just go ahead and take a normal exhale and pinch your nose and hold your breath. And I want you to wait until you have this strong feeling that you need to take a new breath. Just observe that feeling that you need to take a breath. That feeling, oftentimes people credit that as a lack of oxygen, but that's not the case. What's actually happening in your body during that short breath hold is that your carbon dioxide levels are rising in the blood because your metabolism continues, and a byproduct of your quote unquote average metabolism is carbon dioxide. And by not exhaling and off-gassing that carbon dioxide, CO2 levels are rising. So what you can do through breathwork training is train your carbon dioxide tolerance so that you don't feel as breathless when you're working out or when you're actually racing. And therefore, if you don't feel as breathless, you then will not overbreathe when you're working out or when you're racing. Which again, remember, if you're overbreathing, you're going to experience respiratory alkalosis, which is what we talked about earlier, which means the pH of your blood goes up, which means you're experiencing the negative effects of the Bohr effect. Again, which means if you're overbreathing, then the hemoglobin in your red blood cells are not going to release oxygen throughout your body. What we want you to do is be able to breathe through the nose, breathe slow, breathe low into that diaphragm. You can only really do that if you have a strong carbon dioxide tolerance, and you can embrace the positive impact of the Bohr effect by oxygenating your body more efficiently. So those are the physiological adaptations that you can make with breathwork training. Now let's talk about that third category, increased urination. This again is really funneled right back to that increased respiratory rate at the end of the day. As I mentioned, it's only because you're breathing more often that you then have bicarbonate in the kidneys that need to get rid of it through increased urination. So we're going back to increased respiratory rate. Through breathwork training, one of the goals is to strengthen your respiratory muscles. RMT, respiratory muscle training, is a big part of breathwork training. The diagram that you see on the left there, that sort of dome-shaped muscle, that is your diaphragm. So if you've never seen what your diaphragm really looks like, that effectively is it. It's a really important stability-related core muscle right there underneath your lungs. When you inhale, what you're doing is you're effectively flattening out that diaphragm. And by its flattening out, it's changing the thoracic pressure inside your lungs, which allows gas to move into those lungs because of the change in pressure. When you're exhaling, what's happening is that diaphragm, it domes back up, changes the pressure inside your lungs again, and then the gas goes out. The intercostal muscles are the diagram on the right there. Those are the muscles in between each rib bone in your rib cage. And those are a very important part of the respiratory system. For inspiratory or an inhalation, what's being engaged is your internal intercostal muscles. And then the exhalation, it's your external intercostal muscles. But both of those are really moving that rib cage out and back in with each inhale and exhale. Due to the increased ventilatory demands when you're at altitude, you then want to have a better conditioned respiratory muscle system to work with. And through respiratory muscle training as a part of breathwork training, you can actually increase that strength, as we mentioned, by upwards of 15% by some of the research that's out there. And in particular, this is needed to pull in that lower pressure air. Again, if conditioned with respiratory muscle training, it's then going to improve the breathing economy. So you're not actually then taxing your peripheral muscles that are used in breathing, like your chest muscles or even up into your shoulders, which again will not be efficient for your overall movement economy in the mountains, let alone your breathing economy. But then also by having well-conditioned diaphragm and intercostal muscles, you can improve the gas exchange that's happening and therefore ultimately getting more oxygen into your blood, especially amidst that lower pressure air that you face at altitude. Again, to kind of put a pin in this last note here, the air being lower pressure at altitude is not going to move as easily into your lungs. Air moves from a higher pressure space to a lower pressure space. If you're in a lower pressure space, being higher altitude, that air is not going to move as easily into your lungs. So again, your respiratory muscles need to work harder to actually pull in the air. So this is kind of a closing note on the lecture part of this information session here on what happens to your body at altitude and how does breathwork training actually relate to this. Now we can get to some of the fun stuff here. Let's actually experience some of the training. And this is going to start with getting some of your own personal breath assessments. So the breath assessment that we're going to do on this call is something called a carbon dioxide tolerance test. Again, going back to one of the most important factors of your breathing is how well do you tolerate carbon dioxide. This test is going to give you an idea of your own personal carbon dioxide tolerance. The way that this works is right here, now, live, we're going to do this together from a seated position. So if you're standing right now, if you could go ahead and sit down, you're going to sit up nice and straight. You're going to have a nice tall spine, relaxed shoulders to your side, arms laying down to your side, hands maybe in your lap. We're going to take 3 breaths together. At the end of that 3rd breath, you're then going to take a really deep inhale to bring in as much air as you possibly can. We're not just testing carbon dioxide tolerance here, we're also testing some lung capacity elements as well. So you're going to take as big of an inhale as you can. At the very top of that inhale, you're then going to start as slow as possible and exhale through your nose as slow and controlled as possible. I mean, literally, this is like you can barely feel the air coming out of your nose. And you're going to try to extend that exhale for as long as you possibly can. You're going to get to the point where you start to run out of air in your lungs. I want you to squeeze every last bit of air out. And when you've gotten all the air out of your lungs, then you go ahead and stop. And what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to actually be timing this. So the time that's going to be shown when you're done with that long exhalation is going to be your personal carbon dioxide tolerance test score. And then we'll talk about what that score really means. So I'm going to go ahead and guide you through this now. Again, from that seated position, nice tall spine, straight back. Relax your arms to your side. We're going to take 3 breaths together. So go ahead and take an inhale in through your nose, very normal, not deeper than a normal breath. And then a normal exhale. And now take another normal inhale. And now a normal exhale. This will be our last normal breath. Go ahead and inhale. Normal exhale. And now begin that deep inhale. I want you to fill up your lungs as much as you can. Sniff even just a bit more air in, and begin that slow exhale now. As slow as possible. It's like air is leaking out of a tiny puncture in a tire. It's just barely dripping out of your nose. Again, you're going for time. You want to extend this exhale as long as you possibly can. And as you're exhaling, just relax. When you get done with that exhale, take a note of the time that's on the screen. I'm going to continue to run the clock for another 20 seconds or so. You'll get to the point that you're squeezing all the air out of your lungs. If you're still going, great job. Keep it up. Work with that stressful feeling of breathlessness. And we'll go ahead and stop that timer now. So, great job. If you're still going, by the way, good for you. You have a really nice CO2 TT score. So let's see where you actually fare in kind of the range of carbon dioxide tolerance scores. So if you had a between 20 and 40 on your CO2 TT, that's a strong sign that you have some level of dysfunction to your breathing. If you scored a 40 to 60, there's still some things to clean up here, but it's at least somewhat better. 60 seconds is kind of that threshold that we want to achieve in a carbon dioxide tolerance test. If you're in that 60 to 80 range, likely good functional breathing. If you're an 80 or above, you're kind of an elite level carbon dioxide tolerance, and that's really good for feeling breathless on the mountain, during workouts, etc. Now, a little disclaimer for everybody that's freaking out now looking at these scores is if in fact you're at high altitude right now, that's going to play a role in this score, okay? So John, I don't know if you're too worried. You are at least somewhat at altitude in Colorado. I want you to consider that. Also, if you've had some caffeine, I don't know who's had a lot of caffeine at this time of night, but if you've had some caffeine, that will play a role. So just take note of that. So this is your carbon dioxide tolerance test score. Thank you for participating in that fun little assessment. I hope that was interesting and helpful. It sounds like some of you, not to call anybody out here, but Summer, thanks for contributing yours. You got a 24. Yeah, give that another try, maybe on your own tomorrow morning without caffeine, without stress of the day. Try that on your own again and see where you come out again. Thanks. So now let's talk about how you can actually improve that carbon dioxide tolerance score and really improve everything from a breathwork training standpoint. We're going to do an exercise now called Breathe Light. What we're going to do is, much like this name of the exercise says, we're going to breathe lighter than we normally would. This is a bit of a meditative exercise. So again, from that seated position, I want you to start to focus on your breath. I'm going to go ahead and guide you through this now. Focus on the breath coming in and out through your nose. What I want you to do is we're going to use our pointer finger as a guide here. I want you to put your pointer finger right underneath your nose. And as you breathe normally in and out, I want you to feel the air as it runs across your finger. As it comes in, maybe you feel some cooler air come in. As you exhale, maybe you feel some warmer, more moist air come back out. And now with your finger still there, try to relax your shoulder and arm, by the way, but with your finger still there, I want you to begin to slow down your breathing so that you can barely feel the air run across your finger. Here our goal, again, is to breathe lighter than we normally would. That means we're taking a smaller breath in and a smaller breath out. And as you continue to do this, at this lightened breath pace, you might start to feel what's called air hunger. Air hunger is that feeling that you want to take a nice, big, deep breath. This is the feeling that we're actually trying to harness here. What this is a rise in carbon dioxide in the blood. Using this breathe light exercise, we can actually rewire or recalibrate the chemoreceptors in our brainstem to be able to tolerate more carbon dioxide. So again, as you're breathing lighter, breathing more slowly, continue for the next 30 seconds or so. If your breathing becomes erratic, maybe your diaphragm is actually contracting and flattening out to force you to take a bigger inhale. That could be something that you're feeling. Try to work with that and work with that discomfort of the carbon dioxide, straddling that line between comfort and discomfort here for the next 10 seconds. Just 5 more seconds. 4, 3, 2, 1. Go ahead and allow some normal breath to come back. I'm going to teach you a little breathwork protocol that actually offloads carbon dioxide very quickly. You can use this in a workout if you feel breathless, or on the mountain if you feel breathless. And this is called a physiological sigh. Basically, you should take a double inhale through the nose and an exhale through the mouth. So go ahead and inhale through your nose. Pause that inhale. Sniff in again. That's the double inhale part. And then exhale through your mouth. Do that 2 more times here. Inhale through the nose. Pause. Sniff. Exhale through your mouth. Last time. Inhale through your nose. Pause. Sniff. Exhale through your mouth. Hopefully now you feel a little bit better. That is one of the single quickest ways for you to offload carbon dioxide out of your bloodstream. What's happening there is basically the alveoli, the little tiny air sacs in your lungs. They get flattened out when you're not breathing fully with each breath, like we just did with the breathe light exercise. So that inhale, pause, second inhale will reinflate those little air sacs, grabbing as much CO2 as it can, and then exhaling that out through a larger airway being your mouth. That's how that physiological sigh breathwork protocol works. So this was breathe light. Now what we're going to do in the next 3 minutes or so is I'm going to show you what a preparation for high altitude simulation training exercise looks like. This is not a full-blown high altitude simulation training, also known as intermittent hypoxic hypercapnic training. This is more just the preparation for it, but you'll get a bit of a taste of it. So here, I want you to go ahead and stand up. We're actually going to, if you can't do this, no problem. Continue to just sit and watch and be patient for those that are going to do this live. Go ahead and stand up. And again, I want you to bring some focus to your breath. What we're going to do is we're going to take a few normal breaths in and out. After an exhale, you're then going to pinch your nose and hold your breath and begin walking. And I want you to walk for about 15 paces or so. This will be your first set. A second set, you can push it a bit further, maybe 15 or 20 paces, but I do want you to reach that level of breathlessness feeling. So if you haven't already, go ahead and take a normal breath in through your nose and then a normal breath out. And at the bottom of that exhale, go ahead and pinch your nose and hold your breath. And go ahead and walk now. You're counting the number of paces here. I want you to go about 15 or so paces. Depending on your CO2 TT or carbon dioxide tolerance, this might already be uncomfortable doing 15 paces. When you're done with those 15 paces, just breathe normally. We're going to breathe here normally for about 12 breaths or so. And as you breathe normally, I want you to think of those efficiency principles that we talked about. The most efficient breath is nose, slow, and low into the diaphragm. So breathe through your nose. Breathe nice and slow. I want you to breathe deep. Feel the lower parts of your belly and rib cage expand with each breath. Just 3 more recovery breaths. 2 more. All right, 1 last breath. Go ahead and inhale normally in through your nose. Normal exhale. At the bottom of that exhale, go ahead and pinch your nose and hold your breath. And off you go walking. I want you to count 15 or 20 even paces here. Don't do anything really beyond that. Again, this is just a preparation for high altitude simulation warm-up exercise. When you're done, you can swing on back. And that just gives you a taste of what the preparation for high altitude simulation training exercise looks like. And obviously, you can probably already see from here, you can really ramp that up in intensity. You can start to go from a walk to a jog on flat ground. You can start to take that into some steps or a hill going up and down. You can get more sport specific with your movements, again, making very acute adaptations to the very specific muscles that you'd be using in a race or in a competition. So this is how this kind of can scale from here into full-blown high altitude simulation training. This gives you, again, an idea of an exercise that you would do in a breathwork training program. The last thing that I want to show you is something more on the respiratory muscle training side of things. And this is just one short, quick little taste of something that's going to help train the expiratory muscles. Again, what your expiratory muscles are the internal intercostal muscles. They're the intercostal muscles, again, in between each rib bone in your rib cage, and they are helping to collapse the rib cage down to basically force air out. That is what an exhalation is, of course. What we're going to do is something called exhale pulsations. This is from a doctor named Dr. Belisa Vranic. She wrote a book called Breathing for Warriors. This is an exercise from that particular book. Here, sitting right now, we're going to do 120 very short, quick exhale pulsations. What I want you to do is breathe out just through your nose, very short and sharp. And then I want that inhale to be passive. So you'll notice if you do a few quick, short exhales through your nose, if you relax right after that exhale, you can actually passively inhale with the air coming back in through the lungs. If you've ever done breath of fire, Kapalbhati style pranayama breathwork training in yoga, you may have already done an exercise like this. So let's go ahead and do 120 of these. What I want you to do is focus on your back. I want it to be nice and straight, and I don't want your back to move. So I want that back to be straight and still as you're doing this. If you want to, you can put your hand on that lower belly right beneath the diaphragm so you feel each of these exhales. So go ahead and begin this now, 120 in a row. They should be short and quick. As you can see, I'm demoing it. You can see at least a bit of my diaphragm moving with each breath. Maybe by now you're already feeling some of that fire and heat being generated in your core. Those are your inner intercostal muscles working. I'm going to let you continue for the next 10 seconds or so. We're working to 120 if you can get there. 5 more seconds. 4, 3, 2, 1. Good job. Go ahead and take a nice deep breath, kind of reset, and a very slow, passive exhale out. Good work. That is the exhale pulsations, respiratory muscle training breath exercise. So that hopefully helps give you an idea of what breathwork training might look like. Again, the things we just ran through were something called Breathe Light, which trains your carbon dioxide tolerance. We went through a preparation for high altitude simulation training, also known as intermittent hypoxic hypercapnic training. Based on research and practical application of this, you can actually release erythropoietin, increase the red blood cell count within your body, and also strengthen your diaphragm along the way. And then specific to your expiratory muscles, exhale pulsations actually strengthens those inner intercostal muscles, which will help with gas exchange when you're in the thinner air at altitude. So where can you go from here, especially if you've got one of the races coming up here shortly? I've got some free resources out there that maybe you find helpful. We've got a nice following on doing some Monday morning breathwork. Every single Monday morning, I host a breathwork session. It is not necessarily high altitude breathwork training. That takes a bit more unique of an individual. It's more of a targeted, real fitness oriented breathwork training. This is breathwork training more for grounding yourself down and getting you ready for the week ahead. We do work in some high altitude stuff, but it's not really targeted on that, but that can be a fun little breathwork resource for you. I've also got the breathwork guide for hikers, especially high altitude hikers. So if you're looking for practical application of breathwork for hiking, high altitude trekking in particular, that can be a resource for you. And then if you're a climber, I did create a breathwork guide for climbers. So there's some QR codes if you're interested in any of those in particular. That will send you to a sign-up sheet where I can then drop you these free resources that I offer out there to the world. Now on to some paid training options. And in particular, again, our 5-week pre-acclimatization training program. So there's 3 options for this training program. The first one is just the quote unquote paper self-guided training program, and that is $75. A second option is an online video course training for $275. And this has videos, 26 or so modules to work through. It's got videos of me explaining each exercise. It actually has the training program. And then you've got a workbook that accompanies the online training program as well. We've got demos of every single one of the exercises as well as part of this. And then the last option for a paid 5-week training program is personal coaching. And that is $875 if you were to do that. And again, this would be over the course of 5 weeks. You'd be able to work with me, yours truly, and we would actually tailor a specific program for you specifically and your race or whatever it is that you've got coming up. What you should budget doing this 5-week training program is 15 to 20 minutes per day, 6 days a week. These exercises do act nicely as a warm-up or a cool down of some existing training that you're already doing. They're really designed to be complementary to everything else that you're doing to train for something. Now, I do have a little special here for everybody that's on this particular info session with HPRS, and that is something that that we're calling Train Better Together, because people train better when they're together. There's some accountability systems around training in that way. And so for everybody that's on this call, or really a part of the HPRS community at large, if you get a group together, in particular, if you're training with other people for a specific race, you could come in through the training together. And if you were to book the online training for $275, then as a group, you'd actually get that personal training package with me on 3 different training calls that would happen virtually over Zoom. Basically, that's an $875 value for you. That would be at no extra cost beyond that $275. So basically, it'd be a group training at that $275 level. So, for example, if you're training for one of the Sangre de Cristo races coming up here in September, what our training calendar would look like essentially is a training kickoff in just 2 days on August 21st. So that would be this Wednesday. We'd have a kickoff. Of course, these would be recorded as well and shared with anybody in the group. We'd have a second training call on September 4th, and then we'd have our final training call entering taper week, and we work on some specific hypoxic breath hold EPO release style breathwork training on September 18th. That would lead right up to the start date of the 25th or 27th, depending on which mileage race that you're doing for the Sangre de Cristo. So that would be an idea of what you could do specifically starting this week. So I just want to end with a little recent testimonial. Somebody who went through the training program climbed Mount Rainier. His name is Tim. He had some awesome results. Saw literally using his Garmin pulse oximeter how he could change his SpO2 just by the way that he was changing his breathing, which was enabled through the breathwork training program. So I just want to leave you with that little highlight from this. This was just actually last month. So I will open it up to Q&A. If you do have questions, you can throw those into the Facebook live chat here. Obviously, if you're watching recording, not really relevant slide here. We'll sit on this slide. I've got the QR code there as well if you want to check out our webpage to sign up for the programs. But yeah, we can sit here for the next minute or so. And if anybody has any questions, you could throw that into the chat. Or if you want to share anything. I know I heard already from John that your CO2 TT was a 29.
Yeah, a little bit too much weed smoking over here.
Right, exactly. I can't speak to that. Yeah, sorry. That's a different type of training.
We had a clarifying question during the talk.
Yeah,
and that question was, everybody thinks there's less oxygen in Denver, and we just wanted to be clear. It's not that there's less oxygen here. It's that there's lower pressure, and so our lungs are not able to fill as much due to the pressure, right?
So mainly, yes, that is right. So what's happening basically is the relative percentage of oxygen that's in the air is the same no matter where you're at on Earth. Whether you're at sea level or if you're on the top of Everest, the percentage of oxygen of that volume of air is the same. It's roughly 20.9%, 21%, call it. Okay. That's how much oxygen is in that volume of air. However, what's making a difference here is when you're at higher altitude, the density of that air, that volume of air is lower. Therefore, while the percentage of that oxygen is still 21%, you're basically looking at a lower pressure. So what we would call the partial pressure of oxygen in that volume of space goes down. So in an inhaled breath, for example, at sea level, you're still going to take in 21%, but the millimeters of mercury or pressure of oxygen in that volume of air coming in is 160. At Colorado, it's the same percentage. However, what you're taking in per inhaled breath, if you're on a 14er, for example, is 95 millimeters of mercury as opposed to 160. So per inhaled breath, it is reasonable to say that there's less oxygen coming in because of the lower air, but it's not like all of the gases in that volume of air are also going down, nitrogen, carbon dioxide, etc. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's not that there's less oxygen. It's the same amount of
Exactly.
oxygen. It's just yeah, okay. It's
It's
just
the same percentage of oxygen. It just happens to be at a lower pressure. Therefore, as you inhale, your body's going to perceive it as less oxygen per inhaled breath. And of course, through breathwork training, you can combat those effects.
okay.
I'm looking at the chat. I don't see any questions. I do want to thank everybody for showing up. Summer from Southwest Texas. I'm assuming you're close to sea level. You're running in the 200 miler here in 5 weeks. Good luck to you. And then I think we had a few others out there. Ryan and Kelly Norton from Wisconsin. I lived in Wisconsin myself for a little while. And you were at Sheep Mountain, as was I. I was volunteering, so it's awesome to see you. And then we've got some Colorado natives doing Pikes Peak doubler. Good for you, Carrie. I'm wishing you best of luck. Hopefully some breathwork training will help you out with that. And then Gordon, hey, yeah, excited for you as well in using the program. I was happy to see you signed up. So nice to see you again. So yeah, I will basically wrap up with that. I don't think we've got any other questions. Feel free though to shoot me an email at any point in time. My email is anthony@recaltravel.com, RECAL with one L, travel.com. And yeah, if you also reach out to John, I'm sure he'll relay the message to me also, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you've got. I wish you all the best in your high altitude endeavors.
Awesome, man. I really appreciate you taking the time to. My microphone's way over here now. They couldn't hear you through the Zoom, so for a little bit during your introduction, they didn't miss anything too important. Forgive me, but I got the microphone down by the speaker here so that they could hear you. So I figured it out. But thank you so much, man, for taking the time to do that for us. And look, I'll throw this out there on top of it, especially at Silver Hills this year. There were a lot of folks out there struggling with altitude, and it was more than just breathing. Obviously, this has a trickle-down effect into your digestive system, your ability to eat, your ability to digest food, ins and outs, essentially. It's all connected, though, and so I really do believe very strongly that what Anthony has to offer here will benefit a lot of you folks that do like to run with us in high mountain areas and have struggled with the altitude. So I would encourage you. Obviously, I have no financial interest in this. Anthony and I have talked about it. I'm interested in helping our community be better athletes, be able to get up high and do the things that you want to do safely and more enjoyably as well. So I do hope more of you will take a look at what Anthony has to offer, and if you feel like he can help you out, pull the trigger, get the help. There's nothing wrong with adding more tools to your tool belt, and being able to figure out this aspect of trail and ultramarathon running, especially here in the Mountain West. So thank you, Anthony, for your time, and I hope some folks reach out to you.
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks a lot, John. I appreciate the opportunity as well.
Of course. So that's going to do it for tonight's info session. I hope you folks reach out to Anthony if you'd like to hear more. If you got anything that I need to attend to, please, by all means, send me an email. You know how to get a hold of me. Looking forward to seeing everybody in the fall here at HPRS. For now, have a great night, everyone. Thanks for joining us.